I'm Mrs. Newberry, and I am reading first chapter for First Chapter Friday, Sideways Stories from Wayside School by Louis Sachar. And I want to read the introduction to you because the introduction is very entertaining. This book contains 30 stories about the children and teachers at Wayside School. But before we get to them, there is something you ought to know so that you don't get confused. Wayside School was accidentally built sideways. It was supposed to only be 1 story high with 30 classrooms lined up. And instead, it was built 30 stories high with only 1 classroom on each story. The builder said he was very sorry. The children at Wayside like having a sideways school because it gives them an extra big playground. The children and teachers described in this book all go to class on the top floor. So there are 30 stories from the 30th story of Wayside School. It has been said that these stories are strange and silly, and that is probably true. However, when I told stories about you to the children at Wayside, they thought you were strange and silly, and that is probably true too. My first chapter is called Mrs. Gorf. Mrs. Gorf had a long tongue and pointed ears. She was the meanest teacher in Wayside School. She taught the class on the 30th floor. If you children are bad, she warned, or if you answer a problem wrong, I'll wiggle my ears, stick out my tongue, and turn you into apples. Mrs. Gorf didn't like children, but she loved apples. Joe couldn't add. He couldn't even count, but he knew that if he answered a problem wrong, he would be turned into an apple. So he copied from John. He didn't like to cheat, but Mrs. Gorf had never taught him how to add. One day, Mrs. Gorf caught Joe copying John's paper. She wiggled her ears, she stuck out her tongue, and turned Joe into an apple. Then she turned John into an apple for letting Joe cheat. Hey, that isn't fair, said Todd. John was only trying to help a friend. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first the right one, then the left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Todd into an apple. Does anybody else have an opinion? Stephen started to cry. He couldn't help it. He was scared. I do not allow crying in my classroom, said Mrs. Gorf. She wiggled her ears and she stuck out her tongue and turned Stephen into an apple. For the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet, and when they went home, they were too scared even to talk to their parents. But Joe, John, Todd, and Stephen couldn't go home. Mrs. Gorf just left them on her desk. They were able to talk to each other, but they didn't have much to say. Their parents were very worried. They didn't know where their children were. Nobody seemed to know. The next day, Kathy was late for school. As soon as she walked in, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed during class. He was turned into an apple. Nancy said, God bless you, when Paul sneezed, and Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Terence fell out of his chair. He was turned into an apple. Mauricia tried to run away. She was halfway to the door as Mrs. Gorf's ears started to wiggle, and when she reached the door, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Mrs. Gorf picked up the apple from the floor and put it on her desk with the others. Then a funny thing happened. She tripped and fell. The 3 Erics laughed. They were turned into apples. Todd, Stephen, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terence, Mauricia, and the 3 Erics, Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, Eric Ovens, were all turned into apples. Louis, the yard teacher, walked into the classroom. He had missed the children at recess. He had heard that Mrs. Gorf was a mean teacher. He came up to investigate. He saw the 12 apples sitting on Mrs. Gorf's desk. I must be wrong, he thought. She must be a good teacher if she has so many apples. He walked back down to the playground. The next day, a dozen more children were turned into apples. Louis, the art teacher, came back into the room and saw 24 apples. There were only 3 children left in the class. She must be the best teacher in the world if the children keep bringing her apples. By the end of the week, all of the children were apples. Mrs. Gorf was very happy. Now I can go home. I don't have to teach anymore, and I won't have to walk up 30 flights of stairs every day. You're not going anywhere, shouted Todd. He jumped off the desk and bopped Mrs. Gorf on the nose. I don't know how an apple bops anyone in the nose, but Todd did it. The rest of the apples followed. Mrs. Gorf fell on the floor, and the apples jumped all over her. Stop, she shouted, or I'll turn you into applesauce. Uh-oh. But the apples didn't stop, and Mrs. Gorf could do nothing about it. Turn us back into children, Todd demanded. Mrs. Gorf had no choice. She stuck out her tongue. She wiggled her ears. She wiggled first her left one, then her right one, and then turned the apples back into children. Whew. All right, said Mauricia. Let's go get Louis. He'll know what to do. No, screamed Mrs. Gorf. I'll turn you back into apples. And she wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, and stuck out her tongue. But Jenny held up a mirror, and Mrs. Gorf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher. Even though Mrs. Gorf was mean, they didn't think it was right to leave her as an apple. But none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. Louis, the yard teacher, walked in. Where's Mrs. Gorf? Nobody said a word. Boy, am I hungry, said Louis. I don't think Mrs. Gorf would mind if I ate this apple. After all, she always has so many. He picked up the apple, which was really Mrs. Gorf, shined it on his shirt, and ate it. The end of chapter 1. So, if you're interested in reading chapter 2, Sideways Stories from Wayside School by Louis Sachar, come on into the library. We will have many of these books set aside on display, and hoping you will come in and read chapter 2 and chapter 3 and chapter 4. Thank you.